I would like to announce our first panel, and I will wait for the slide behind me. It's a panel that is entitled Of Systems and Prototypes. And indeed, it's a panel that tackles systems, prototypes, and complexity, the tactics, strategies, and goals of the design process that, as you can see, are also the strategy, tactics, and goal of a nation state and all of an architectural studio. So once again, they're expanded to many different realms. And we will have to present our speakers. First, we will have Mae-ling Lokko. Mae-ling Lokko, I had never met in person before, but I always admired her. She's an architectural scientist, a designer, an educator, and she's now teaching at Yale and also has a consulting company, a design company in Ghana. But I remember following her when she was at RPI, which is a polytechnic institute akin to MIT that is near New York, that has some of the best design with waste that all over the United States. And I really love it because she has devoted her life to the upcycling of agro-waste and biopolymer materials, but she doesn't only talk about them, she also realizes amazingly beautiful projects with it. And I think it's very important to remember that design is also form, it's also aesthetics, and that elegance is a form of respect and a form of communication. Second, we will have Shaway Yeh, great friend and wonderful expert in fashion. She's actually one of the foremost voices in fashion criticism and in fashion also advocacy in China. And in 2017, she founded a consultancy that's beautifully called, that is, it's called yehyehyeh. I love it, that pushes the sustainability agenda among fashion designers and producers. So just by doing so, she could change the world, considering the shape, the size of the market in China. Last but not least, we're gonna have Aaron Maniam, who is exactly the kind of quintessential Singapore individual that I was talking about before. He's a civil servant, therefore a rock star, and a poet, and an intellectual, writes poetry with friends, and never sets his mind at rest for the little that I've known him, and can speak about the future in a way that nobody else can. So with that in mind, I'm gonna call to the stage and help me welcome Mae-ling Lokko.
Thanks, Paola. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to be back on this part of the world. I actually grew up in Kuala Lumpur, not too far from here. And my family would come here to, well, for me, I only came to ride the Sentosa cable car. So from the perspective of my 8 to 9-year-old self, Singapore was definitely a place of the future. And so I'd like to talk today about 2 simple prototypes that speak to today's theme of designing for the future. By no means are these sort of solutions, but rather speak to the recognition of the prototype, the working power of the prototype to identify value, to transform and circulate that value in a world of inherited and increasing complexity. So this is what I call the mother prototype, made out of coconut. And I call it the mother prototype because I'm still learning from it today. And in some ways, it's a simplification of a very complex global material economy, and it sought to sort of connect ambitious outliers in the startup industry in Ghana, collecting urban agricultural waste, and emerging bioadhesive companies in upstate New York. You wouldn't necessarily put these 2 groups of people in the same room, but they are bound by this being outliers' as agricultural legacy. It was also a way of rethinking the value framework that we have inherited today. For everything that we make or build with, we know that that value is typically extracted from our ecology, usually the land. It's transformed through labor, the conditions of which can range from slavery to being overpaid. That value is accumulated by an owner, be that a private corporation or the state. It's used by consumers and often produces infinite quantities of waste, materials that we don't have use for. And we know that this system is rife with a number of forms of alienated labor, which may come in the form of land, for example, that has been used over and over again from monoculture cropping and nutrients are not returned in a timely manner. We know that this may come in the form of labor that is underpaid or working in harsh conditions, be that on the farm or the factory. Consumers who have no idea of the impacts of what and who is affected by the products they consume, and no way to even participate in mitigating those impacts. And by and large, this large generation of waste that actually Shaway is talking about. So as an architect and designer, I've become really interested in trying to understand and experiment with new forms of agency. When we begin to recognize that for a long time, our business model as architects has not necessarily evolved. We've sort of occupied this position between owner and consumer that drives this top-down extraction cycle. And to really explore this underbelly on the bottom half of this graph. And so through the development of the coconut prototype, we really saw it as an opportunity to strategically place ourselves at the bottom half of this framework. It's also, sort of a case study in a much larger problem around agricultural waste, which could be arguably one of the world's most underutilized material streams. It's renewable, it's generated every year, and it's so intimately tied with our growth as a species because the more we grow, the more food we produce to eat, and so generates this material stream. Often we see the premature downcycling or incineration of these materials before they even have a chance to show what they're capable of. So prototyping here is sort of this ongoing process of proposing new value for these materials. And then in the 21st century, I think this is an incredibly interdisciplinary process and one that is rapidly accelerated when academia and industry collaborate. As a designer, this value identification process is also, in Paola's words, an exercise in respect, understanding what these materials are made from, where they come from, and all of the historical processes that went into making them. And in doing so, we open up a whole sea of material futures. In this case, it generated this continuum of strong mechanical materials, the kind of stuff that replaces plywood, to materials that are incredibly low density and breathable, stuff that are incredibly good at filtering and holding small particles like moisture in our humid air or pollutants in our indoor air stream. The second aspect of this allows us to escape the technological bubble and really enter the realm of the social. And I think there's an immense need for this, and we can push the value of the prototype once we enter this realm. In many ways, there's a lot of need for being able to translate the value that different stakeholders bring to this framework, whether that's nature, whether that's all forms of invisible labor that we don't adequately recognize, and also what is the currency of translating these values from natural capital to cultural capital to economic capital, and not necessarily in that order. And lastly, in understanding and translating this value, how can we design a circulation framework where the distribution of value is dynamic and it is fair? In other ways, how do we use this system to generate justice? To a large extent, we need this to address our growing equity gap. And this can largely take place in communities where these robust social relationships exist, or if not, the prototype is a way of activating and accelerating these relationships. So this brings me to the second group of prototypes made out of fungal mycelium, the vegetative state of fungi. And our goal was to really increase access and participation to people outside of a factory or academia or a research lab. And it's really based on this idea that mycelial technology can function under really ambient conditions, really low energy, to digest a wide array of agricultural waste to grow new materials in less than 6 days. And so for us, we wanted to work with our industrial partners who typically manufacture these materials in controlled factory settings. And we wanted to scale this up, not only the tools, but the basic infrastructure to engage a wider public. Putting the prototype in the hands of the public was sort of a double-edged sword. We could scale up technological innovation in terms of growing materials, but it was also a form of seeding, a form of radical public education around fungi. We were very interested in prototyping technologies for participation, Could we make custom toolkits to make special building materials? Could we use everyday objects like buckets from Home Depot to grow new types of bricks? In the first instance that we tried to do this, this was working with an urban farming group in Liverpool called Squash Nutrition that grows food across the city in the yards of schools. And through a series of education and mycelium manufacturing workshops, we worked with 200 people to grow the panels, inoculate and grow the panels. We decided to do this in the actual gallery of the Royal Institute of British Architects North to show that this type of process could happen right on site. And so you'll see in the center of the gallery, the grow chamber, and this was sort of used over the course of 2 weeks to grow all the panels that formed a sort of entrance tunnel to the gallery itself. In Arles, in France, which sits in the Camargue region, where a large percentage of France's organic produce is grown, we sort of blew open the complexity of taking just agricultural waste and began to expand this to food waste and waste from invasive species that was harvested. Using a very simple wall system in a community kitchen called the Kitchen Collaborative in Griffoy, we developed a sort of hierarchy of standardized panels, ones that we knew how they would behave, and then more experimental forms formed from the waste coming out of the kitchen itself. For us, the architectural design studio in universities is still a very precious space to test and evaluate all of our assumptions logistically, technically, and also how to rethink how one might manage the coordination of all these tasks when you're working on a community scale before we take such things public. And so this is it installed, flipped over in a beech forest known for honey mushrooms in Arnhem in the Netherlands. So I'd like to end by returning to this diagram that proposes new roles for the agency of the designer. Prototyping, in many senses, is a working fluid from actively thinking by doing. And here we can not only begin to identify material futures, but really we're immersing ourselves in small ways in the future while building it. So thank you and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mae-ling. And I would like to call on stage and introduce to Singapore, Shaway Yeh.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm so happy to be here and to share some of my thoughts about redesigned fashion systems. I don't think I need to introduce myself. I think Paula introduced me much better than my company profile. And this is an image I'm going to share because 3 weeks ago, well, I've been traveling around the world because pandemics. And then, so 3 weeks ago, I was in Germany, Documenta. And then this is one of the most photographed work. It's by Nest Collective from Kenya. So it's installation built with bale of secondhand clothes or wasted textile where people ship to, like, well, not people, well, actually more correctly, global nodes, like i.e. European countries, North American countries, ship to the global south. Like for trading or for exchange, and then so they use this material to build installation to remind people about this phenomena, and then it's a very beautiful park revenues, but it looks like installation by like a dumping site. And then 2 weeks ago was like the whole world of the Fashion Week resumed. So this I think was in New York, is one of the show Zimmerman's. I wasn't there. So what's the linkage between these two images? And then do they have any linkages? Because when we talk about fashions, and this is what comes to on my mind. What is the color of the season? What is the item we should be buying? What should I wear this with that? And then what is the must-have bag? And then, so it's all about consumption. Of course, you talk about designers or something, but in the industry, more and more people will focus and talking about something like this. And then I think, I don't know if you're shocking as me when I first saw images and story like this. So these are two images taken from all our foundation's work. It's a foundation they are, they're most set up in Ghana. So this is in one of Ghana, is Kantamanto market, which is eligible state is the world's largest secondhand trading hub. So every month, I think there's 25 million tons of clothes, again, be shipping by global nodes to there. and then there's 30,000 of people working on resorting them, cleaning them, reprinting them, and trying to sell them again. So on the lab, you'll see this young girl, it's called Kayaya. So their work is the head porters. They need to carry all this clothes through. And then each tons, what the clothes they're carrying is about, on average, is like 55 kilos. So I think usually way more than due. So you can imagine the harm to do with the neck and the spine. And a lot of them like have very serious physical problems because this is kind of the work they're doing. But even they're working so hard and then all these people wins out. So still, like only less than 60% of clothes, which is really have certain kind of value, especially increasing with the rampant fast fashion. So more and more clothes, which is actually valueless racks, end up there. So more than 40% will be sent to the landfill dump site, which on the right-hand side you can see is seriously polluting the local like water systems with shedding of microplastic or like hazardous chemicals. So they must have something wrong from what we're thinking the beautiful clothes on the wrong way to like a polluting seaside in Africa or like a severely damaged young girl's bodies. So, and then, there's some numbers there. Over 100 billion of garments are produced every year, and less than 1% is only being recycled because of a design problem, but actually it's also a system problem. So what is this system? This system usually is we call linear economy. It's simply we take something, we make something, and we just dump it. And then because we think the resource is cheap and then infinitive, and then we just dump it and more and more and more. So the whole system, like the fashion industry, require a new redesign. It needs a system change, and then it needs a circular economy, saved by Ellen MacArthur Foundations because of advocacy on circular economies. So what is circular economy? I think most people probably know, but then I'll just kind of explain a little bit with this kind of famous buttergrade diagram. So there's like two sides. On the left side, the green side is called biological cycles. So everything which is kind of biodegradable, say like a food waste or something, which after consumer using, it can still go through they still have kind of astral values. They can go back cascading in different kind of value streams. And whenever it's not can be used anymore, they can go through like a biorefinery, become biochemicals, or it can go through composting, become biogas. And again, it become a nutrients to feed back into the whole soil and system. And on the right-hand side, it's called technical cycle. It's for things which cannot be biodegradable, say your mobile phone or your car or metals. So which we can buy maintenance, which is like so they actually shouldn't be a consumer items. They should be used and be taken care of, and to prolong the usage, to maintain it, to repair it. And then if you don't want it anymore, you can resell it, redistribute it. And if it really cannot be used anymore, then part of it can be recycled back to the whole system. So circular economy is actually meant to keep like materials and product in the loop, and then to be trying to be used and reused as much as possible. So it's creating a economy there's no waste, and then everything can retain its most values. So, and then, there's three principles about like a circular economy: eliminate waste and pollution, keep products and material in use, and regenerate natural system. But I'm going to trying to attack like redesigning fashion system from three different perspectives. So first process is redesign supply chain. So Bill McGrady was the former chief supply chain officer from PVH. PVH is this large fashion group who own like Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfigers, and all those companies. So it was saying the first step to change this system is to stop thinking of supply as a chain. It's actually a mesh, a lattice, which is dynamically adjustable and responding across offshore, nearshore, and onshore collaborative supply platforms. So the old way we call supply chain is actually one way. It's actually kind of designed with a retail model. It's about 10, 20 years old, where you produce, and then with, of course, it's like kind of the end product of the collaboration. So we're like a Western brand with their branding power, with cultural hegemony, with their requisition power, they become this kind of conglomerate. And then the design, the marketing, whatever, and then you send all the designing order to the developing countries, like mostly in these regions, so because much cheaper labors, and then in huge quantity, you can kind of just decrease the price and then making more profit, and then you push it to the consumers. and without they wanting it or not, and if you don't want it, you end up with a lot of dead stock, or return, or damages, and all those values, which is not being really accounting back to the whole kind of profit systems. So we can obviously, like, there's something wrong about this thing, because a lot of value of labors, energies, and materials went into it, but without being used and not being accounted for. So that's why, like, so with this new, like, well, first of all, I think the biggest challenge is like, so this is kind of actually nowadays supply chain should look like. So it's not like a one-way chain. It's actually multiple chain. And i.e. because like more and more consumer demand, and consumer are from not only just developed country, but developing country, there's more and more markets, there's more consumer demand. And with advance of digital technology, so there's a more, it requires more agile response. And also because the interruption of the supply chain during pandemic, so make people reflect. They need to have well combined offshore production with nearshore and then onshore. So nearshore, onshore is the image in the future should be a hub of many, like a green and fast responding manufacturing in all different continents, plus locally onshore providing services and repairing and back to the whole loop. So of course, like a redesigning supply chain, also including like human aspect and natural aspect. And human aspect is a kind of more like working with people and for the people. So this is an example about making for change and the public. So they work with local community disenfranchised women and offer them skills. So they can also do like a community manufacturing, working with customers. So it both benefit them, also benefit the community. And same thing was working with natural system, which I'm not going to elaborate because I'm running out of time. And this is basically what Mae-ling's works were, and we just corresponding each other. So second is redesign material sourcing, and another big focus is on biodiversity. So we should restore the whole natural system to make it much more like to keep the health of the soil and then the water systems and biodiversity, which can sequester more carbons. And again, so like for example, like FiberShare, they're building this new fiber system, which is both building the healthy ecosystem and health community, and bring those two together, and then eventually bring consumer more close to the lab. And last but not least, I'm going to quickly finish. It's very important to redesign experience, basically redesign business model. So can we come up with a business model which is based on degrowth? And I think, yes, we can, because more and more designers are thinking like that. For example, Christopher Raven will say, is there anything more cooler, more radical than designing nothing? But we can still sell it. And then some people say there's so many old clothes is already beautiful lying there. How can we make it even the challenges? How do we make it even more beautiful, but not doing something new? Or can we go through repair, making customer has more emotional connection with the product you have? And all this is all the values which can be translated to monetary value. In a way, like we can still making money, but without making more new products. So here are four very simple like form. One is building your digital wardrobes, and the other was swapping, and then customizing and repairing, and to make anything last longer, and of course re-commerce. Okay, thank you. I'm running out of time and quickly finish my points.
Thank you. Thank you, Shaway. Great. And I would like to call to the stage Aaron Maniam, rock star.
Paola, thank you very much. That was far too kind an introduction than I deserve. But thank you very much also to the Design Council for the invite to join you today, because this is something I feel very strongly about, and I'm really glad for the opportunity to talk about this theme. I was very affected by a recent movie that I'm sure a lot of us saw, and I was really thinking about how the fact is that design is something that affects and is also affected by all of us, doing everything, everywhere, all at once. And so as I talk about designing policy now, in addition to the earlier panels, the earlier speakers on designing natural systems as well as designing fashion and supply chains, I hope you'll see that this really is something that affects all of us, everywhere, all at once. I really wanted to start with 7 basic principles that I think affect the design of policy, not just in Singapore, but using lots of Singapore examples. Right, and I'll tell you the number 7 now, so you can keep that in your head as we count down along the list. But I want to start with the place that all policy has a place of belonging. And this is one of my favorite diagrams. It's called the Kinefin diagram. It talks about this Welsh word, cynefin, which is really the fact that there are multiple places of belonging. And all policy belongs in one of these four domains, right? The known domain, which is the realm of simplicity, where 1 + 1 = 2, and we know with predictability what outcomes will look like. The complicated domain is a domain of slightly more involved work, where you might need to do some research, but fundamentally there are still predictable and stable patterns to be observed. Complexity, which is the top left, is the world of unclear cause and effect patterns, which is actually where most policy these days takes place, right? Unless you're dealing with fairly simple things like technical design. And what we're dealing with in complexity is situations where cause and effect are not clear, and therefore we have to find ways to tease out those causes and effects and make sure that we understand them, right? Whether this is the world of dealing with online falsehoods or dealing with demographic change, this is the world where many of us end up designing either rules and regulations or norms and policies. And then there's the world of chaos, right? The world where cause and effect are utterly unclear and you can't even discern them at all. Many of us tend to think of policy, including some policymakers, that most of our work lies on the right-hand side of this diagram. But that's not true. A lot of the most interesting work in policy actually happens on the left-hand side, the unordered space, so to speak. And knowing that there are these different places of belonging, I think is one of the first and most fundamental principles in knowing what sorts of design principles we need to apply. This then brings us to a second point, and this is something that Paola and Dawn both actually started hinting at already, right? That all policy is not just about the present, but about the future as well. And you will find that in Singapore, so much of our policy is acutely aware about the future. It is acutely aware of vulnerability, and we are always thinking about how we can stay relevant and anticipate different possibilities, different scenarios in the long-term future. This is a map, really, of all the logos of agencies in government, because agencies are part of the theme today, right? Agencies that have some kind of futures or foresight function. This is a list that has grown phenomenally over the last 20 years. This is a function that actually began in the Ministry of Defense. We experimented it in the ministry, in what we call the Prime Minister's office at the center of government, and that continues to exist, which is why the center there is that first middle diagram is actually what we call the Center for Strategic Futures, which has a quiet little black swan in the middle of the logo. I don't know if you've noticed that. Bit of design there also that we kind of mucked around with for a while. But now that this ecosystem has grown, right, to include so many other parts of the government, and that's intentional because we do believe that all policy is about bringing into bear the relevance of the future. Third, and this actually will directly echo what Shaway just talked about, all policy is about designing experiences. I have a slightly rebellious streak in me, and I often say to all my colleagues who are willing to listen that everything we do in policy is design, because we're either designing something for the public to experience or businesses, or we're designing something for our bosses, right? And if you write an email thinking it's going to be read on a laptop, but you forget that your boss actually checks their email on their phone, then you have designed for the wrong experience, right? The experience has to take care of the human needs that this individual might have. And these are just some examples of how we've tried to apply experience design in our work. The left-hand diagram is the Ministry of Manpower, where they realized that when people come and collect work passes, they often have real problems finding childcare. And so one simple way to make the design of the experience more pleasant and palatable is to have space for children to actually hang out. And that made the process of collecting passes for foreign workers so much more pleasant, and it made even more unpleasant outcomes much more palatable for people. The bit on the right, that diagram is really, that letter really is all about how we've used social norming and again, the designing of experiences in the letters that people receive so that there's a bit of subtle nudging and behavioral movement to having people pay things like their taxes or do their contributions to their Central Provident Fund in as punctual a way as possible. Right? And so we experimented with things like printing on different colored paper, social norming, and telling people what else their colleagues were doing. And we found that there were actually interesting results along those lines. The reason these first three principles are so important, right? Complexity, futures, and experience design is really because everything we do in policy explores interdependencies. This is one of my favorite quotes, right, from the quantum physicist David Bohm. And I think everything we do actually is about policy making in a world that has potential for quantum entanglement. Everything is interconnected because the universe is enfolded in everything and each thing is enfolded in the whole. As we do our policy design, therefore, we have to find ways for the whole to nourish the part, but also for the parts to add to and complement and contribute to that whole. And this sense of interdependencies is why we often speak about whole of government policy making or whole of nation policy making, because none of us can do this alone, and we need to bring the interconnectedness to bear as much as possible in policy work. Number 5 is really the idea that the data that we use in policy needs to be far more diverse and variegated than it has been before. We're very adept in most governments at using quantitative data. We're much less adept at understanding the importance of narratives and stories and ethnographic data. As someone who works a lot with qualitative data myself, both in my personal research as well as in the work that I do, I think this is something we need to address quite quickly, especially because in the world of complexity, in order to deal with unclear causes and effects, we have to find ways to tease out the stories, right? Ask people what makes them happiest or most irritated about policies that are out there and programs and events that they've been part of. And when we get those open-ended questions out there, I think we find really interesting data points that can allow us to act in a much more concrete way. This is why Clifford Geertz's work on ethnographic approaches, right, this fundamental anthropological approach to policy making, I think is a critical thing we need to do, and it's an important balance, right? Which is why the work of the Design Council and why festivals like this are so important, because building up our qualitative literacy is something that we need to have both as a policy-making outfit as well as policy consumers like all of you. I wanted to talk a little bit about experiments as well, because you've heard about prototypes from both Mae-ling and Shaway. And prototypes can only happen if there is an experimental culture and mindset, if we are willing to try, even if we don't know what the outcomes are. If we know what the outcomes are, then we're actually just templating, right? That is not an experiment. Experiments have to be about not knowing and being willing to put resources into potential failure. And of course, we have to calibrate those resources. We don't want to roll things out at a nationwide level if we're not sure about the results. But we can run prototypes, beta tests, small-scale experiments. This is one of my favorite examples where 9 years ago, we ran an experiment to offer free rides on the mass rapid transit system for people who took the train before 7:45 a.m. Now, I know many of you are probably wondering, why would anybody ever do that? But some people did, right? But what we realized was not enough people did it for us to then justify this being a policy going into the future. But I love the fact that we tried. We experimented with it for months, we looked at what the data told us, and then we responded to the feedback of that data in figuring out whether we wanted to roll things out as a more detailed policy or not. And far more of our policies, I think, need to run on experimental data of this kind. Finally, let me say a little bit about policy involving participation and play. This is where the other agency becomes important, right? Not just the government agency, but the agency within each of us. We need to participate a lot more in the design process, and that's why you'll find that many processes in Singapore these days are all about how we can do policy work together. Government has huge responsibilities and must undertake those, but we can involve citizens to help counter and complement our cognitive biases as well as the deep set assumptions we might be bringing to the world. And if in that process, like the Singapore conversation, which is the process that produced the chart that you see on the left, in that process, we need to try and include more play-related elements as well. I think we are far too often too serious about the work that we do, and we need to bring elements of serious play into that work. This is why at our Civil Service College, we actually set up a simulation training laboratory that looks at designing serious games for both training purposes as well as for policy design, so that as we immerse people in potential play-like situations, we gain data and we gain a far deeper insight into the process that they go through in understanding policies. So there you go. 7 principles to understand everything, everywhere, and everyone's role in the policy process. And I hope these are themes that we can come back to as we go through the Q&A very shortly. Thanks very much.
Wonderful job. You can stay, Aaron. Okay. You can stay, and I'm actually going to call back on stage Shaway and Mae-ling. Would you mind coming over? Thank you. This was quite an amazing panel. What is great is that you don't often see fashion and architecture of agro-waste and policy together, but there were many points of connection, which I really love. So you're 3 designers. and you deal with systems. So let's talk about one of the biggest cliches of design, the cute chair cliche that always drives me crazy. Let's talk about elegance, formal elegance, and its power, right? Its power to convince and its power to just like convey the message. First of all, we all want to know who designed the black swan of the, whatever it's, Center for Strategic Futures.
Yeah.
That is amazing.
Yeah, his name is Bernard Toh, actually. He's working on a few sets of different policy regulations now in the digital space. But yeah, it was his first job, and he did a wonderful task with it, I think.
Yeah, really good. So once I was running this conference with scientists and designers together, and they were asking each other's question, and the designers were asking the scientists, why is it that whenever you show a PowerPoint, you use the worst background and ugliest typeface, and you really make it ugly? What's your problem? Oh, we're afraid that we won't be taken seriously if we make things too pretty. So let's talk about that. In your role as a policymaker and civil servant, how do you use formal elegance? And does your work as poet influence that?
Wow, Paola, that's a big set of questions there. But I love that you began with that, because I do think, like I said earlier, right, everything we do is actually policy design. And I've said to my team before, sometimes the formal elegance applies in terms of the overall experience that we're trying to create. This might be about the quality of the material that you use. And let me give you a very concrete example of this. Right? We had a set of scenarios some years ago where we wanted to think about potential for regional destabilization, how we were going to deal with the US and China and its increasing rivalry in the world. And we could have just written that up, right, in kind of traditional government report, right, 100 pages, lots of footnotes, very, very rigorous. And we had a version that was that, of course, because rigor should not be compromised. But we figured that the best way to actually communicate this was not in these enormous reports, which highly pressurized decision makers are not going to have time to read. What we did instead was we produced 3 articles, kind of simulating products that they would normally see. So we had one kind of mock economist article. We had one article that was from the South China Morning Post, simulated, of course. And then we simulated another one of what we call the daily press clippings, right? These go online every day to a major group of decision makers. And it's just a summary of what's out there in the press. And we decided that we just simulate the cover page of that, right? And so when you send things to people that are vaguely familiar, but also then have minor iterations because suddenly they realize, oh, I'm reading this product and it's meant to be the daily press clippings from 2027, right? Or it's going to be the Economist online or the E-Economist. That was my little pun that we made, right? E-Economist, because it was all happening in the digital space in the year 2027. You then give yourself license to riff on the present. And I think that's an example of where you can play with formality, but take it in directions that allow for people to question the deep assumptions that they might have. This is just one example of how we've communicated futures thinking. And I always think of that as a way of dealing with creating experiences for people that they can both relate to, but use as a base from which they question themselves as well.
Thank you. Shaway, your same question, but from another angle, because you live in a world where aesthetic form is one of the primal drivers, right? So how do you reconcile the need for sustainable approaches with aesthetics, or do they need to be reconciled at all? I mean, there was a moment in which being sustainable meant wearing bad sandals and and just like bad messenger bags, and now instead it's definitely not like that. But so do you ever have any issues combining the two, or not anymore?
Well, I think not anymore for various reasons. Number one, I think, of course, if you're talking about fashion or design, everything, I mean, it should be beautiful, but depends on your definition about beauty, right? But I think more or less everyone is kind of the same. So, and then I think it's like when it wasn't so beautiful because there was a limited practice, because there's only certain sector of people who are like sustainable designers, well, whatever, and also available materials not so many, the practice is not so many, and consumer doesn't understand about that. So there's a certain kind of image, but now actually sustainability is in the mind of every designers. I mean, if they're young designer, they are well educated, they will think about that by themselves. So it's still, you need to design something which is desirable, because I mean, fashion industry still somehow is selling on desire. But as to what is desirable, which is important, because like, I think one of the designer who's saying something very interesting, which is totally, I think, like, can we design like not just only beauty and identity, or can we design social belief and social value into the new identities? Because people love fashion because it's something to show who you are, whatever, right? So I want to belong to this tribe, I imagine I'm a Renaissance princess or whatever. But then what about all this social belief? What about your commitment? It should be part of a value, and it should be designed within a design languages.
I like the fact also that you said that some of the young designers just have it in them. So it's a new baseline. Yeah. It's not anymore something that has to be a design behavior that you need to teach, but right now it's part of the process. So you don't need to abdicate beauty in order to show, in order to show piety, so interesting. And Mae-ling, in your case, you teach agro-waste use and an approach whereby you use what you have to make what you want in different parts of the world. So still sticking to form and to elegance, material culture of different places, and the use of agro-waste. Can you say something about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe...
was it Ghana where you did the workshop, or was it Rwanda? I can't remember anymore.
That was, the mycelium was in Liverpool.
No, but there was another
in Ghana.
One. In Ghana, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So much like Singapore, Ghana is very much concerned with building and exuding this sort of modern identity. So when we're designing agro-waste building materials, we're going up against identities of materials like concrete and glass and steel, which are materials of the future. They communicate wealth and all sorts of things. And so the pressure to give these low value materials, in quotation marks, a new identity is much higher, because you have to change the social perception. And so we kind of fall back to some of the more basic human relationships that we have with material. How do you seduce, produce desire to touch materials, for example? So a lot of the tactility, although there's environmental performance, is about getting people to, touch the nooks and crannies of some of these materials. And it's also about trying to also celebrate the impermanence of some of these materials. And it's a tough one, I think a lot about how we have examples in our lives of things that when they age, they increase in value. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a blanket that as it goes over time, it gets softer and just the right amount of comfort. Or leather, you stretch into it and whatnot. And so that aesthetic is quite difficult to design and capture. We do that with mycelium primarily through texture. It gets this velvety sort of surface. If you, on the 6th day, it's a long story, it just gets velvety. But those type of qualities are some of the things that we try to use to build a connection between people and these materials. And in doing so, hopefully cast a new identity for them. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I think it's probably the most difficult audience to design for. Mm-hmm. The hunger to appear modern, and then the materials that you have right at your feet that you don't necessarily value.
Form, material, and identity, it's really deep, So the most voted question from the audience is for you. And it's how can the public service be more open to prototyping and experimentation when there are constraints in time and resource? They don't know that that's much faster than the other way. You tell them.
It's funny. The constraints in time and resource are exactly what helps us to prototype better. I mean, that CSF logo was not the result of us paying a consultant millions of dollars, right? Bernard designed it on PowerPoint. And then we kind of prototyped it a little bit more and we thought, okay, this is great, let's go with it. No, but I think there's a fair question at heart there. It goes back to that diagram I started with, the Kinefin diagram. The world of constraints and resource optimization is particularly important on the right side of that diagram, right? What you would call the ordered space, where there are predictable outcomes, and we need to realize that in those instances, we want to achieve technical efficiency. But in the world of complexity, where we want to run experiments, it's not that we want to be profligate with the resources, right? We are not saying run experiments in a way that is utterly wasteful. We want to run experiments that are calibrated with clear questions that are being asked, but they must be questions. They must be things where we don't know what the answer is, where we have hypotheses that can either be falsified or not, and that's why we run the experiments. And I think a lot of this actually boils down to two things. One is it's about individuals being willing to say, we're going to start this, and it might fail, but if we fail, here are the things we are willing to learn, right? To set up a sense of what the lessons are going to be and what the insights will be. And then it's about leadership also setting in place a culture whereby they encourage that sort of open-ended questioning and to say, all right, I'll let you do this, but we do it for 3 months, we run the experiment, and then we look at the data rigorously. So we don't waste resources by running it indefinitely, but we actually allow the experiment to give us the insights and give us data and feedback about what the universe is actually up to. That, I think, allows us to both balance, right, between the needs of constraints and optimization, but at the same time, allow us to ask these open-ended questions and move to get answers to them.
Thank you. That's great. For Shaway, do you think that a fully circular system in fashion or any other industry where design and production is involved is actually possible?
Yeah, I think it's possible, but I don't really think it's going to solve my problem. It's not going to solve all the problems we have right now, because I think now the whole fashion industry to bank on circular economy, as if we reach a circular economy, it would be fine. So we can still keep producing more and more because all the nutrients will going back into
Sorry,
the
we cannot pour the water for you because of COVID regulations. You have to pour it yourself. No, seriously, that's why.
Oh, really?
Otherwise,
Okay.
yeah.
I see.
Yeah, thank you. So circular is not the only answer. You know, there was another question. I'm going to mix it in with this. Somebody was asking also about degrowth.
But because I think fundamentally you need to change the business model, because now a lot of people rely on circular as a way, like, since we can endlessly, which is question mark, circular everything, so we can keep producing, we keep buying more, we can keep disposing it. So, but I think the problem is this kind of keep producing more, keep buying more, keep selling more, because we still need to going after the growth. That's the fundamental thing. So that's why I think more people radical thinking is, can we have a degrowth economy? Can we still have a prosperity, but without going after this kind of infinite growth? And that's why like more progressive designers of brand are trying to do.
And that's it. Last night I was discussing with Jacqueline Paola on why does everything always have to get bigger?
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
It's like, why? Okay. So this symposium is based on the idea of really preaching system thinking. And we've been talking about our own systems, but I would like to ask you, do your different systems talk to each other ever, and how?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so...
Clearly not, right? Okay,
Well, I mean...
Totally.
They should, so let's talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely. I mean, Shaway showed the photo of the OR Foundation doing work in
God,
the sort of
I
second
just found out
plan.
yesterday, actually, Mae-ling is also working with them.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. But, you know, I've worked a lot with textile companies, sort of small home-based enterprises. So they're women who work at home, so completely distributed, and they dye. And some of them have got very smart and have come together to dye together. And the result is that we concentrate the toxic water effluent coming out of the batiking process. And so one of the things that we've been working on is developing from this new superfood called moringa. I don't know if that's famous here, moringa tea.
I mean,
not yet.
Not in the United States, maybe here. Moringa, okay.
But there's a waste product that is amazing at treating the textile wastewater effluent. It helps all the bad stuff, heavy metals clump together and settle. And essentially you get clean water, which is below EPA regulations, but then you also get this sludge, another byproduct. What do you do with that? And we discovered we could make these really interesting sludge bricks. But then when you put it into practice, you realize you have this infinite resource of sludge bricks that are quite toxic. and we just realized we're just treating the symptoms of a terrible system from the start. And so we've kind of gone back to work with natural dyes. And it's through them that I came to meet the OR Foundation. They're essentially working on thinking about textile circular economy as part of a public health infrastructure. And I think that's really important that we see this type of material framework as very much about the health of our ecosystem. And digitally, I mean, honestly, I mean, waste is something that is everywhere. Yeah. And it's also low quality. Yeah. So in terms of dynamic, distributed variables, it's a really difficult system to model. So, you know, we're sort of working with industrial engineers trying to model how to predict supply and demand. And then once you even get that under control, how do you organize people on a certain scale to change or transform these materials, which is a logistical digital infrastructure really that is behind it. So yeah, it's a physical and digital exercise. So yeah, definitely.
Well, I think we also discussed about this, like in terms of fashion, when we talk about like making a much better supply chain, right? I think the whole digitalization is quite important. But the thing is, you kind of usually just only tackle one power plant. So you make more agile response. You produce, well, then you produce maybe more on demand, but that doesn't mean you produce less. You produce even faster. And you're selling it for much cheaper money, cheaper because you cut down so many waste and costs. So it looks more kind of more efficiency, but in a way it makes the whole fast fashion become super fast fashion.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that's actually a very terrible vicious circle because some other components need to come into this kind of equation, not just all about efficiency.
And does anybody ever talk to Aaron and tell him, you know, because these are wicked issues. I mean, it's like you make things so
fast and so
and the thing I wanted
necessarily available.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think what you're describing here, right, is this idea that we do need to get all of a system into the room, right? All the systems within a larger system into the room, having these conversations with one another. And that's partly why the participatory processes that I mentioned in my last slide are so critical, right? Because it's about bringing these different sets of assumptions, these different worldviews, different ways of seeing into a discussion with one another so that hopefully there can be mutual learning. And then sometimes actually have the systems potentially even conflict, but find ways for the space of that conflict to actually be resolved along the way. I think this is a different kind of role for government compared to what we might normally be very, very familiar with, right? We're familiar with government as provider of security, with government as a taxation authority. We're familiar with governments as imposers of order. All those are important jobs and functions. But increasingly, in complex spaces, governments have roles as conveners, as facilitators, and aggregators as well. This doesn't mean they abdicate their responsibility and say, all right, well, you people just decide, right? Talk to one another, talk to me, and then we'll make a decision together. Sometimes governments have a role to play in making decisions, but I think that creation of the space, that convening function, is actually quite critical. And that allows for the voices that both Mae-ling and Shaway have been talking about to actually emerge and be part of the conversation.
And actually, one other question from the audience is what happens? I mean, citizens and governments can think about all these things, but very often it's businesses that innovate and that build the future, and then sometimes we have to catch up with them by regulating them, turning that down. How do you deal with that?
You know, there's this great F. Scott Fitzgerald novel that short story that I'm very fond of. It's called The Crack Up. And he writes in it that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing thoughts in the mind and continue to function. The key being, of course, continuing to function, right? Not just having the two thoughts and then falling apart in the whole process. I hear some rueful, recognizing laughter here. We've clearly all been in these sorts of situations. And the key, I think, to answer your question, right, is to find ways to balance those polarities, right? To be part of the participation, to be part of engendering the conversations, but at the same time, in certain instances, recognizing that we don't consult on everything. No government worth their salt is going to ask people, how much tax would you like to pay, right? Because no matter how lovingly that question is asked, the answer is not going to be one that optimizes the macroeconomy. But you can ask people, how do we design better experiences for you? What can we do on the land transport systems to make sure that those experiences are designed in the best possible way? We can design education better. This is not about consultation in the extreme. It's about consultation to do better policy and better delivery. So I think we need to hold those tensions those trade-offs are in our heads a lot more and then continue to function.
Talking about the design of experiences, that was really fascinating because the design of experience has become an integral part of, I don't want to say, well, that was another question that I won't have time to answer, to ask you all, should we do away with the word consumer consumption, et cetera? But experience has become really fundamental, also both for people who want to sell as much as possible and also for people who want to educate as much as possible. So can you tell about the educating side of the experience design in fashion?
Well, education. Well, I think one thing is like what Mae-ling just mentioned, like because like when an object looks older, it appears to have more value. But unfortunately, that's not the fashion reality, right? I think people want the next new things. Yeah. So I think there's this culture. So how do you design certain kind of exhibit to make people appreciate it? Something actually has experience. Something has. So one of my favorite subjects right now is repairing.
Yeah.
Because I think that's kind of the most underrated, like in all this talk about how do you upcycle something, how do you use dead stock, or all this common practice in sustainable fashion. I think that's one of the most underused ones called repairing. Because when you want to repair something, you already have an emotional attachment to that stuff. And also because the reason I'm thinking is because I used to mentor young designers, and he's a Japanese designer living in Vienna. He's the only designer I thought he do study about this. Roughly about 120 way about the Japanese way of repairing textiles. And the patterns, the skill, the needlework, it looks so beautiful. It looks more beautiful than some of the couture clothes.
Yeah, like saris in India, the saris.
So how come no one is kind of really promoting that? So it's not only preserve the traditions and preserve the old objects, and then it can add so much more economic value to that piece of the work. And then, so, I mean, that's just one of the examples. So I'm constantly looking into people repairing things.
Great answer. So
I feel like when you have to repair something, you learn more about it.
Yeah.
From our bodies
completely true.
to objects.
The aesthetic value that looks so much more beautiful with all those stitches and whatever adding onto it.
Very true. No. 2 fast questions to end. Life cycle of your lifespan of your materials.
Ooh, was that from the audience?
Yeah.
Yeah, I always get that.
Yeah, of course you do. It's like,
I would treat any of these materials like wood. You know, if you take care of it, you don't expose it to continuous moisture. You allow it to dry, you allow it to breathe. They'll last a long time. The mycelium in outdoor conditions.
Yeah. Wow.
If it rains a ton, obviously it's going to degrade. Because it just houses other organisms that begin to degrade it. But there's a lot you can do to improve its lifespan. And I think we're barely scratching the surface.
Yeah, exactly. We need to see what happens, right?
It's 1 strain out of 5 million, and we only know that's 8% of all the fungi. So,
Aaron, biggest failed experiment.
The whole point about experiments is that they shouldn't be big. Bilingualism is one of those policies that we set up predicated on the assumption that most people could be equally good at 2 languages at the same time. I think we realized along the way, and Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew did say this himself, that was probably an assumption that was flawed. Some people can, and we want those people to build that bilingualism as well as they can. But the fact that we introduce gradations of language training in primary and secondary school, I think tells us that some of that initial sets of assumptions needed to be updated.
Thank you. Great job.